On the morning of February 28, 2026, Iran's supreme leader was killed in his own capital. Within hours, dozens of senior commanders were dead alongside him. And 9,000 kilometers away, inside the Kremlin, the phone that was supposed to matter most in that moment simply didn't ring the way anyone expected. Iran and Russia had signed a treaty just over a year earlier. One, both governments called historic, a 20-year pact meant to bind two nations against a common set of enemies. Yet when Iranian skies filled with American and Israeli aircraft, Russian forces did not move. No jets were scrambled from Russian bases. No warships altered course toward the Gulf. The question this raises isn't really about one bad night for Tehran. It's about what a partnership between two heavily sanctioned, isolated powers actually promises when the shooting starts, and what Iran may have believed it was buying with years of loyalty, armed drones, and diplomatic cover that Russia, it turns out, was never fully prepared to repay. To understand why that morning unfolded the way it did, you have to go back to January 17, 2025. When Vladimir Putin and Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, sat down in Moscow to sign what officials on both sides described as a defining moment in their history. The Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership ran 47 articles long, covering everything from defense industry cooperation to counterterrorism, energy, cybersecurity, and finance. Russia's foreign ministry called it a milestone that would guide the relationship for the next 20 years. It replaced an older 2001 framework and was, by any diplomatic measure, the most formal document the two countries had ever produced together. And yet, tucked inside the fine print of that same agreement was something that mattered more than any of the headlines it generated. There was no mutual defense clause. Nothing in the treaty obligated Russia to send troops, aircraft, or missiles if Iran came under attack. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko told the State Duma this directly when the treaty was ratified, stating plainly that Moscow had no obligation to intervene militarily on Iran's behalf. Tehran's negotiators, for their part, had pushed just as hard to avoid committing Iranian troops to Russia's war in Ukraine. Neither side, according to analysts who studied the negotiations, was ever willing to bleed for the other. That distinction sat quietly for over a year, largely untested, while the two countries built out the more visible parts of their relationship. Iran had already given Russia thousands of Shahed-type drones and short-range ballistic missiles for use against Ukraine. Technology transfers that Western intelligence agencies say significantly reshaped the battlefield, allowing Russia to sustain a tempo of long-range strikes it could not have maintained from its own production lines alone. In return, Russia offered Iran diplomatic cover at the United Nations, expanding trade routes, and promises of advanced military hardware, including talk of Su-35 fighter jets and even the S-400 air defense system, one of the most capable anti-aircraft networks in the world. Trade between the two countries was climbing too, rising more than 15% to nearly $3.8 billion in the first 10 months of 2024 alone, according to figures cited in the treaty's own supporting documentation. And both governments pointed to that growth as proof the relationship was maturing beyond wartime convenience. On paper, it looked like reciprocity, a genuine exchange between two states locked out of Western markets and looking for mutual insurance. In practice, the hardware kept not arriving, and the gap between what was signed and what was shipped would only widen as the relationship went on. The first real test of what the treaty was worth came in June 2025, months before the document had even formally entered into force. On June 13th, Israel launched a surprise assault on Iranian military and nuclear sites, opening what would become known as the 12-Day War. Russia's response was almost entirely rhetorical. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called his Iranian counterpart to condemn the strikes as violations of international law, and Moscow pushed for an IAEA assessment of the damage to Iran's nuclear facilities. But no weapons moved. No Russian assets were repositioned to deter further strikes. Iran's aging S-300 systems, delivered by Russia back in 2016 after years of delay, took the brunt of what came next, and according to reporting on the conflict, failed to shoot down a single Israeli aircraft during the fighting. It was a preview of a pattern that would repeat itself on a much larger scale 8 months later, except this time, Iran would lose its supreme leader. The Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty officially entered into force on October 2, 2025, ratified by parliaments in both Moscow and Tehran. Russia's foreign ministry marked the occasion by calling it a milestone reflecting the strategic choice of both leaderships to confront shared challenges in what it described as an emerging multipolar world order. Diplomats from both countries met again in December to sign a follow-up cooperation plan mapping out consultations through 2028. Every public signal pointed toward deepening alignment. Then came the morning that exposed how much of that alignment was symbolic. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of strikes against Iran in an operation the Pentagon internally referred to as Epic Fury. In the opening 12 hours alone, close to 900 individual strikes hit Iranian targets. Among the dead was Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader since 1989, killed alongside several senior officials in what is now formally documented as the assassination of Ali Khamenei, a decapitation strike carried out by Israeli aircraft with American support. It marked one of the most significant single blows ever delivered to the leadership structure of a sovereign state outside of open, declared war. Iran responded within hours, launching hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at Israeli cities and at American bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. Inside the Kremlin, the reaction described by Russian and Western analysts was one of genuine shock, not calculated restraint. According to reporting from the Peace Research Institute Oslo and the Jamestown Foundation, Russian officials had anticipated, at most, a narrow strike focused on Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, something in line with the pattern set the previous June. The scale and speed of what actually happened caught Moscow flat-footed. Putin convened an emergency virtual session of Russia's Security Council within hours of the news breaking. In an unusual departure from standard practice, the Kremlin published no readout of that meeting at all. Russia's foreign ministry did issue a statement condemning what it called American and Israeli aggression, and Putin personally offered condolences over what he termed the cynical assassination of Khamenei. But that was, in practical terms, the extent of Moscow's response. There was no invocation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Iran had joined in 2023. There was no mention of BRICS, which Iran had joined the following year. Both blocs, despite years of Iranian participation, sat entirely unused as diplomatic or material levers in the moment Tehran needed them most. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was asked directly, days into the crisis, whether Russia planned to provide any assistance to its treaty partner. His answer was telling in its plainness. Iran, he said, had not asked for Russia's help. He added that Moscow's position was consistent and unchanged, careful phrasing that avoided committing to anything, while also avoiding an outright admission that the alliance had limits. Analysts reading between the lines concluded that Russia's involvement would likely be confined to statements at forums like the UN Security Council, exactly the kind of symbolic gesture that had defined the relationship's crisis response pattern since the previous June. That's not to say Russia did absolutely nothing. According to documentation compiled on Russia's involvement in the war, Moscow did quietly provide Iran with intelligence support, including data on American military positions in the region. And this followed a longer pattern of what analysts describe as clandestine air defense assistance delivered over the preceding years. But intelligence sharing is a fundamentally different category of support than the mutual defense many observers had assumed the 2025 treaty implied. It costs Russia little, carries low risk of direct confrontation with the United States, and crucially, it's deniable. Analysts at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs have described their relationship using a term that captures this precisely: strategic transactionalism, not an alliance built on shared sacrifice, but a series of calculated exchanges, each side extracting value from the other while carefully avoiding exposure to the other's wars. There's a reason Russia calculated things this way, and it goes beyond simple caution. Moscow has spent more than 4 years fighting an enormously costly war in Ukraine, one that has consumed a significant share of its military production, manpower, and diplomatic bandwidth. Reporting from the Jamestown Foundation notes that Russia's own clandestine deliveries of air defense equipment to Iran over recent years, whatever their scale, made little practical difference against the kind of overwhelming strike Israel and the US carried out, and that the Kremlin simply could not spare significant additional resources given how much Ukrainian missile and drone strikes were already straining Russia's air defense stockpiles at home. Put simply, Russia was in no position to fight 2 air wars on opposite ends of the continent at once, and when forced to choose, it chose to protect its own war effort. There's also a colder, strategic logic sitting underneath the caution. Analysts writing for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies point out that a prolonged American entanglement in the Middle East works in Russia's favor, regardless of what happens to Iran, because it diverts U.S. military resources and diplomatic attention away from Ukraine. From that vantage point, watching from the sidelines wasn't a failure of the partnership. It was, in a sense, the partnership functioning exactly as its architects designed it. Neither government had ever agreed to bleed for the other, and neither one did. This calculation had already shown up years earlier in one of the most concrete, trackable threads in the entire relationship, the S-400. Iran had wanted advanced Russian air defense systems for over a decade, going back to a 2007 contract for an earlier system that Russia froze in 2009 under Western and Israeli pressure. That freeze pushed Iran to develop its own domestic alternative, the Bavar 373, which Iranian officials have repeatedly claimed rivals Russian technology, though independent assessments question how competitive it truly is against modern stealth aircraft. Russia eventually delivered a limited run of S-300 systems in 2016, years late, after Iran threatened international arbitration to force the issue. When Iran pushed further and sought the more capable S-400 around 2019, Bloomberg reported that Putin personally turned down the request, with Moscow-based defense analyst Ruslan Pukov explaining that any real or perceived strengthening of Iran risked Russia's relationships with Saudi Arabia and Israel, relationships Moscow had no interest in jeopardizing for Tehran's sake. By September 2025, reporting compiled by Forbes noted there was no public evidence that even the previously discussed Su-35 fighter jets, which Iran had reportedly paid for years earlier, had ever actually been delivered, with some of the jets originally intended for that order instead going to Algeria. And when Israeli strikes hit Iran's last operational S-300 batteries in late October 2025, what remained of Iran's Russian-supplied air defense network was effectively erased before the bigger war even began in February. So when the strikes of February 28th arrived, Iran was defending itself with a domestic system whose real-world performance against modern stealth aircraft had never been convincingly demonstrated, because the Russian systems capable of doing that job had never actually arrived in meaningful numbers. Iran's own defense minister had insisted back in 2023 that the country didn't need the S-400 at all, citing confidence in the Bavar 373 as a homegrown equivalent. Whether that was genuine strategic self-assurance or simply the public face Tehran put on a request Moscow had already quietly declined is something only officials in both capitals could say for certain, and neither government has ever fully clarified it on the record. The aftermath of the war has been just as consequential as the war itself, and it's still unfolding as of this recording. Ali Khamenei's death triggered what Iranian state structures call an interim leadership council, formed within a day to prevent a total vacuum at the top of the state. On March 8th, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was elected as his successor, a figure widely described by analysts as more hawkish and more repressive than his father, and one whose ascension drew protest even from parts of the U.S. government watching the succession unfold. Iran's Assembly of Experts, the body meant to formally oversee succession, had its own building destroyed by Israeli strikes in early March, delaying and complicating the process it was supposed to manage. By late March, reporting from the New York Times described Iran's leadership as functionally paralyzed, its decision-making disrupted by damaged communications infrastructure and internal power struggles born of paranoia after the decapitation strike. That instability has not resolved in the months since. By late July 2026, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz was publicly characterizing Iran's leadership as divided, marked by what he called internal fighting, with no public statements attributed to Mojtaba Khamenei during extended stretches of the ongoing crisis. Iran's infrastructure has suffered just as severely as its political structure. As of late July, reports indicate power outages affecting 18 of Iran's 31 provinces, electricity being sold to industry at multiples of the standard rate, and reservoir levels supplying Tehran sitting at their lowest point in a century. Iran's state electricity company has documented the loss of over 4,000 megawatts of generating capacity, with damage recorded at more than 2,000 points across the national grid. This collapse didn't happen in isolation. The UK's House of Commons Library notes that the strikes landed when Iran's government was already at one of its weakest points in years, following extensive protests earlier in 2026, driven by a struggling economy and deteriorating infrastructure. Protests the regime met with heavy force and mass arrests that have continued throughout the conflict. Many of Iran's regional allies and proxy networks, meanwhile, had already been substantially degraded by years of separate Israeli military action dating back to 2023, meaning Tehran entered this war with less regional support to draw on than at almost any point since the 1980s. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil trade passes, has become its own flashpoint in the aftermath, with Iranian military command warning tankers that deviate from designated routes of consequences, and shipping traffic through the strait dropping sharply as insurers and shipping companies weigh the risk. Diplomatic efforts brokered through Oman and Qatar have continued in fits and starts, including a proposed 50-50 joint management framework for the strait. But, as of late July, no durable agreement had been reached. Meanwhile, Khamenei's funeral, delayed for months by the chaos of the war's aftermath and finally held in early July, became one of the largest security operations in the Islamic Republic's history, with processions moving through Tehran, Qom, and the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala in Iraq before burial in Mashhad, drawing crowds officials projected at up to 35 million mourners. Against this backdrop, Russia has continued behaving less like a wartime ally and more like a patient long-term investor, positioning itself for the reconstruction phase rather than the fight itself. Analysts at Special Eurasia have described this explicitly. In the event of strikes on Iranian infrastructure, Russia's calculated role is not that of a security guarantor, but of a future reconstruction partner, particularly in Iran's civilian nuclear energy sector, where Russia remains involved in overseeing and expanding Iran's nuclear power capacity toward an ambitious target of roughly 20 gigawatts of generating capacity. In late January 2026, just weeks before the war began, Iran, Russia, and China had signed a broader trilateral strategic pact. One state media in all three capitals hailed as a cornerstone of a new multipolar order. Analysts note that pact is unlikely to translate into a binding commitment that would compel military intervention, but it does raise the diplomatic and strategic stakes of any future confrontation, since an escalation with Iran now implicitly touches Russian and Chinese interests, even without a formal mutual defense clause forcing anyone's hand. What emerges from all of this isn't really a story about betrayal in the dramatic sense many headlines have reached for. It's a more precise and, in some ways, more unsettling story about the nature of the relationship Iran actually built. The 20-year treaty was real. The intelligence sharing was real. The drone and missile transfers that helped sustain Russia's war in Ukraine were real and substantial enough that Western intelligence services consider Iran to have meaningfully shifted the balance of that war. But the assumption, held by many observers and perhaps by parts of Iran's own leadership, that this kind of cooperation would translate into military protection when Tehran itself came under existential attack, turned out to be a miscalculation. Iran gave Russia hardware that Russian soldiers used on an active battlefield. Russia gave Iran diplomatic statements, intelligence tips, and a reconstruction seat at a table that assumes Iran survives long enough to need reconstructing. Whether this pattern holds if a future crisis threatens something, Russia values more directly its access to Iranian territory, its nuclear cooperation contracts, or the broader multipolar coalition it's been building with China, remains an open question that current events cannot yet answer. What the record does show, clearly and repeatedly across both June 2025 and February 2026, is that Russia has drawn a consistent line between rhetorical solidarity and material risk, and it has not crossed that line even once when Iranian cities were burning. For a country that spent years supplying the drones now flying over Ukrainian skies, that distinction may be the most expensive lesson of the entire partnership. A lesson written not in the language of any treaty, but in the empty runways where Russian aircraft never took off, and in the air defense systems that were promised, paid for in some cases, and never delivered in time to matter.